when you said you were a progressive, being a progressive was a state of mind. All right. And it affected hosts of different arenas of American public life and private life. So I consider myself a progressive. Now, I don't necessarily always identify with the folks that I just mentioned, but keep in mind, when I hear America say, make America great again, my immediate thought is, well, I thought we were great. Like, I don't like the idea that we're not great. I think we're moving forward, and I don't view America as not great currently. All right. A similar argument is in your textbook, which I find it offensive, not because of cancel culture or any snowflakey reason, but the arrogance of a generation of people in our country. If you turn to chapter 36, they actually titled the book chapter American Zenith. You guys know what a zenith is? It's the height of something, which means everything that happened after the 1950s is going what? Well, guess who wrote the book? People who grew up in the 50s, right? They're the ones that are writing this. They're the ones who describe themselves as the greatest generation. And I consider that fatalism. I don't like it. Make America Great Again was the slogan in the 1980s. So there's this sense that there's something wrong, that we should go back to the past. And that is a hallmark kind of modern conservatism. Is that whatever in the past was better than where we're going. So progressives are trying to make change. Now, it doesn't always mean liberal or conservative. It means there are things that need to be reformed, things that need to be improved. That's the mindset of the progressives. So we're talking about targets. It's an unbelievable amount of things that progressives wanted to do. Now, keep in mind, this umbrella covered many different areas of public life, like I said. So you have this group called the muckrakers. You had the suffragettes, who are the women activists. And I'll show you all these different groups in a minute. But at the core of the progressive dream, so this is number 2 if you're doing along. At the core of a progressive is the belief that the government exists as an agency for human welfare. So not simply to, enact a military and a handful of other roles. So I thought about this weekend, the Senate passed its version of the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, all right? The CARE Act to help out the American people during the pandemic. Well, we had 2 other stimulus bills passed under President Trump and Congress. So this will be the 3rd one, right? Well, the whole goal behind that action is to help the American people. It's to try to ensure the country's people aren't dying or out of work and out of money. So the goal is to use the government, and that is a major change. And I give a lot of credit to those populists for making that. This was the first group of people who really argued that who offered solution to your problems. Now, yes, the government. Now, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is going to get elected saying that government is not the solution to your problem. Government is your problem. So it's going to kind of come full circle 100 years later to where critics of this think that there's too much government, too much regulation. And so all things in life, I believe, have to have balance, have to have equilibrium. So if you're critical, this is a period when there was virtually no government interference in anything or help in anything. The flip side would be too much government. That's the argument America is, and that's our sort of pendulum that we fight with to this day. That's conservatives versus liberals now, is how much government, but virtually no conservative is going to say today, no government. You understand? Or very, very, very libertarians maybe would make that argument, but even conservatives are going to argue for some degree of government involvement. Like I said, Congress passed that stimulus under President Trump. By no means not a conservative by definition. So what are some of the areas? What are some of the things they're going after to fix? Perhaps most importantly to the progressives, this would probably be number 1, the targets. But most important to them would be to fix the dangers, the damage of the Industrial Revolution. So particularly the second Industrial Revolution. So all the things we were talking about before in factories, unsafe working conditions, child labor, physical danger to the employees through lung diseases, terrible work hours, low income. All of these were goals of the progressives, right? But there was also within industry progressives too, like people who actually were in the factory system saying, can we make it better? Can we make it more efficient? Can we make it a smarter? So it's very, very much an attempt to use reason and the instrument of government together. Urbanization, another huge problem. So the cities were sort of as they are to this day, often in America, where all vices are magnified, to paraphrase another figure in history. So crime higher usually because you have more people concentrated. Poverty high, particularly in the big cities then. Diseases. So, these were major areas that needed improvement. The question of immigration. And of course, how to deal with these cyclical depressions is going to be a huge issue. Like by 1893, it was becoming clear that every generation or so was going to have a panic. And they wanted to fix that. So lots of different reasons to want to make the world a better place. And that's really what progressives believe. They believe that through their intelligence, through their training, through their skill, they can make the world a better place, but certainly America a better place, right? So I would remind you that these were going to be typically bourgeois people. And by that, I mean the middle class. So if you look at this movement in history, if you follow the chronology, today we often look at this as sort of cultural wars. So help to the poverty equates to, a left position. And I think it shouldn't. I think helping the poor should not be a conservative versus liberal position, but it has been for much of history. So you're going to see a lot of, interestingly, people will turn to the government for a solution, and then a large segment of the country will turn to faith for a solution. So you'll have this sort of pendulum that swings back and forth between sort of Christian solutions. In mind, conservative Christians believe that the private sector, i.e. the religious sector, can solve the problem. So if there's a problem of poverty, God's storehouse will fix it, or the churches will fix it. Those kind of things typically, or mankind. If we fix the morality or immorality of mankind, then these problems won't exist anymore. So lots of that debate, kind of back and forth in our history as well. So keep in mind, the key to progressivism is the thesis that government can make life better for most people. Okay, that's at the core of its values. And it will incorporate members of both parties at all levels of government. Now, I want to remind you that there are many people who would ultimately be in the progressive, excuse me. So when it says what movements were the origins, out of the agrarian movements, particularly the Populist Party, you have ideas come from that. You have a group called the muckrakers. Now, the muckrakers are journalists. They're journalists who would write in these monthly magazines and sometimes in weekly newspapers or dailies what was wrong. They would hold a spotlight up to the worst elements of society. Now, they're named muckraker by Theodore Roosevelt. He actually gives them that nickname. He talks about in the book Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, there is a description of the man with the muck rake. Now, muck is a not pleasant word for like human waste or animal waste. So, that stuff. So somebody has the unfortunate job of being a poo scraper, right? Like that's their life, right? And so TR says these poo scrapers, these muck rakers, will never, all they can do is look at the muck, right? And they will never look up towards where the crown is, right? And so for him, these people are both useful. See, he says they are indispensable, but they sometimes get overzealous. So in other words, all they ever do is what he would say is complain. So for TR, you had to find a balance between complaining in Collier's or in McClure's, right? And getting in there and solving the problem. But a muckraker would say, it's your job, politician, to solve the problem. It's my job, journalist, to expose the problem. You understand? Like they would argue, it's not the role of journalists to go out and fix America. That's the elected. That's the body public. That's the people need to be informed. So TR respected these folks. He hung out with quite a few of them. But at the same time, he thought they just weren't positive enough. They were far too negative. And so they didn't spend any time looking up at the celestial crown. You should really hear TR talk. He's hilarious. He loved being president. It was bully. Anyway, you're going to hear that word bully come from him. And back then, that word didn't mean like a bully, it meant like an awesome thing, like something was bully. It was great. It's spectacular. So when he calls the presidency a bully pulpit, he's not saying it's a way to beat people up and get their money, or, you know, it's like a wonderful thing to have for all the American people to hear you. So here you can see him raking the muck with an investigation of, if you're looking carefully, it says meat scandal, which we'll certainly get into. All right, so the muckrakers, journalists named that by TR who wrote for these various periodicals. Socialists, you know, as much as socialists get negative view here in America these days, you know, you got to give it a shout out to what's happened in Europe. You know, if you live in Norway or Sweden or Denmark, you have the highest standard of living in the world. You have the highest, like, you're ranked #1. So democratic socialists, which are certainly what Europe emerges as, are coming up with solutions. Now, these socialists varied on their spectrum of socialism. So they range from your democratic socialist types who are like Bernie Sanders today, or, you know, heck, most of Western European history, to extreme socialists who wanted complete government takeover of everything. Okay, so there's a range of views within that spectrum. Don't forget the social gospel, very, very important group, because these are the folks working in the cities as Christians who believe that, you know, like if you go to God's storehouse today, you might be surprised to discover they take food stamps. So if you receive food stamps, that's part of you have to trade that for food giveaway, right? So if you talk to poverty groups, they're not going to say, yes, the churches are going to solve the problem. They just aren't. They're going to say, without government assistance, we would be overwhelmed. Does that make sense? So that's their point of view, particularly the ones dealing with immigrants and the working poor in urban environments. Okay, there were many economists of the era who saw some role in government. It just varied depending on where they were on free market versus full government control. You know, somewhere in between. And of course, feminists will look at the suffragettes. So I've got here a list of the most famous of the muckrakers, the most famous of the progressive journalists and authors. On my list, they're not in the same order as they appear in your text, so you might want to make some changes. But I would want you to be familiar with all of these. So I put in here sort of a paragraph, not a paragraph, but a parenthetical that explains what their views are a little bit. So Jacob Riis, plight of the poor, particularly in New York. So this is this Danish immigrant who is going to hang out in America in the cities. And I have his books, a couple different copies of it back there, because he's also a photographer. So I should show you some pictures. I feel like it's almost impossible to talk about Riis without letting you see his pictures. So, I'm going to pull this up while you're copying there. But he wanted to shine a real spotlight on the abject poverty of the American poor. Okay, and so he went into the tenements, into the dumbbell tenements, and he photographed them. He took pictures of how awful the conditions were there. He got data as a social scientist on how horrible life was for millions of people, you know, and particularly children, as you can see here. So these photographs, he was trying to, I guess you might say, prick the heart of the reader. And this book becomes an absolute landmark work as far as people seeing this and really being shocked. Keep in mind, you know, one of the beauties of being middle class is the luxury of not having to look at things we don't want to. You know, we can say, no, thanks, I'm not interested. And so this book sort of catapulted the issue of inner city hardship into the minds of the American public. You can see these children, homeless children, sleeping by city grates, barefoot, hungry. So that's Jacob Riis, and I definitely want you to know his name. Now, Henry Damaris Lloyd's book is an indictment of Standard Oil. The title, Wealth Against Commonwealth, it's a criticism of how this powerful corporation, Standard Oil, and you shouldn't have to, you know, be reminded who that is. So with Rockefeller's power is flexed all the way to the state house, to local government. So this guy could, you know, he would say this guy was able to manipulate Rockefeller, the entire American public, and that's pretty powerful dude, right? So I would definitely be familiar with him. Wealth Against Commonwealth, the good of the people. Thorstein Veblen's title is pretty easy. The fact that the leisure class are not contributing to our society, the fact that they're exploitative, that's what he argues, is that this group of people are really abusing their role. These would be the advocates of the gospel of wealth, for example. Lincoln Steffens. So here's a guy who opens up the book, literally, on municipal bosses, on municipal machines. And so if you've forgotten what that means, bribes, kickbacks, these guys aired this stuff. So this is the dirty laundry. And this was in this book, this periodical here called McClure. So this is one of the magazines that would put out these interesting, we might call these today exposés, right? Investigative journalism. If you found out that there was a company down the road dumping toxic, stuff into your drinking water, you'd want to know about that, right? So he was very familiar with the various machines. Now, Ida Tarbell is another critic of Standard Oil, and she is going to write a history of Standard Oil that is going to ultimately lead to the dissolution of Standard Oil. So her book is extremely effective. Yeah, so I mean, all of these people are key, but I guess if I had to put a superstar beside any of them, you definitely want to know Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. These are the ones that routinely could appear on, like, I don't know, test quiz, unit test, AP exam. But The Jungle is probably the most noteworthy because of what is created immediately as an outcome, as sort of a result of this book coming out. This book attacks, and I've got a copy of it back there too, if you guys ever want to borrow any of these books. This book attacks the conditions of working in the meatpacking industry, which, by the way, is still horrific. This is the highest rate of accidents in American workforce in meatpacking now. The problem is when Upton Sinclair writes his book, he's a socialist, and he's trying to get better working conditions and rights for workers in meatpacking. The problem is his description of how meat is created, particularly things like potted meat. Now, keep in mind, this is right on the tail of the Spanish-American War, where American soldiers were given poisoned meat, meat that had embalming fluid added to it to keep it from rotting. Right? Like, you don't eat that. So what he wrote about was, in some of these packing rooms, they would sweep the floor, and whatever was on the floor would get swept into like the sausage rolls. So like rat droppings was very common, dirt, whatever, and they would just sweep it right into it. And then he would also describe that people would lose their fingers, and that would go into their meat, into your meat. So you were basically eating people, among other things. So, Sinclair would very famously say he aimed for America's head, or heart, I think actually he says, but my book landed on its stomach. So once we found out that the meat we were eating was corrupt and poisoned and nasty, that is going to inspire Theodore Roosevelt to create with Congress the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So you've probably heard of USDA approved, right? Well, or how about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration? So these are going to be two things that come out of this. The idea that food should be safe for your consumption, all right? Because there were no rules saying that food had to be safe for your consumption, all right? And then Dreiser, who wrote all kinds of different books, we talked about that, Sister Carrie already, but his works are about the corrupt moneyed interest of this country, so of this company. In other words, they were running this country like a company, and you can sense 100 years later we kind of come full circle. It's not the heads of corporations like GE or U.S. Steel now. It's mega financiers and banking and Wall Street, but it's still the same principle. So these guys are the muckrakers and ladies. And remember, they appeared frequently in national publications that were not huge. Like, they didn't have huge audiences. A lot of people didn't buy monthly magazines, but the people who read McClure's and Collier's, they were important people. So, you don't have to reach everybody as long as you reach the people who are important, kind of thing. And that's who their targets frequently were middle class people. Now, remind you that that there are lists of reformers, and they're going to inspire Theodore Roosevelt. And in fact, Theodore Roosevelt is very much a progressive. So while he was critical of these muckrakers, he is very supportive of this. So if I had to most define who these people were, I would say the key word is that they were middle class reformers. Middle class reformers. So almost throughout history, it's middle class professionals who frequently create change. And I don't say that simply because I'm a professional in the middle class, but because think about it. If you're working poor, you aren't educated probably, and you don't have time or the energy to be a reformer. And if you're really, really rich, you're probably part of the status quo who doesn't want it reformed, right? So it's this middle class often throughout history that has affected much of the change. And so if you think about in our society, who the people are that are frequently helping others, so to speak, doctors, lawyers, teachers, business managers, not the elites, but, not the Andrew Carnegies, but the people who are making enough money to be able to spend time reforming or to have a wife who's a reformer while they make an income. You understand? At that time. So really, really faith in education. If I had to connect them to another thing in history, these are like the great civic humanists of the Renaissance. People who said, I can use my education to reform society. So when I became a public school teacher, and I made a conscious choice to do this. This job was not a fallback. This was, I thought about law, I thought about business, I thought about politics, but I thought the thing that would most give me the opportunity to give something was an education. So my goal since day one has been to elevate the students of this community, to elevate them academically and succeed business-wise. So I have a firm belief in that. And that's one of the reasons why I consider myself a progressive. I don't think that, our best days are behind us. I think that we have great opportunity ahead of us. Lots of new organizations created to benefit people. The NAACP was formed during this period. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce for businesses, particularly small businesses. The American Bar Association to make sure that lawyers are licensed and act in a professional manner. So these are non-governmental volunteer organizations that have had a huge influence. And they typically came from cities. So they were often middle class, urban, and not focused solely on self-interest. You understand? Not focused solely on what's in it for me, because they viewed this as good for society and thus good for them too. They're like paying it forward. The goal is to improve all of society. And when I ask the demographic, a demographic is a group in a population, a unit of a population. So your demographic is middle class, young middle class people, often urban. And, I think about the 60s. Most Americans have this idea, young people, that like the 60s are filled with hippies running around being tie-dyed and silly and dropping acid or protesting the Vietnam War. Well, no, my mom and dad grew up in the 60s and they were working class. You didn't go protest if you were working class. You had to go to work. But it was the kids of the well-to-do middle class. So college campuses, well, think about who's on college campuses, middle class people's kids, right? So that's often where you'll see the most active stuff. Think about who back in history. Now, granted, Thomas Jefferson was not middle class, but John Adams, very middle class, right? From that. So we have a society where merit allows for achievement, right? And they wanted to help more people. Now, I mentioned the socialists, and they were very organized. The socialists were far more organized then than they are now, and they wanted to get rid of capitalism. They believed that industrial capitalism, they could consider to be evil. Like, while it was making great wealth for the benefactors, like the creators of the factories, it was making no wealth for the working class. You just worked and then you died. And their most famous leader, who will run for president while being an inmate in federal prison, is Eugene Debs, who was the leader of the American Railway Union and also the leader of the Socialist Party. And he would get close to 1 million votes while in prison as a federal prisoner for having protested or spoken out against the federal government. But socialists were considered, as they are often now, too extreme, right? Like too far to the left. So when I think about Joe Biden is sort of a historic this. He's a moderate progressive. All right. Barack Obama, this, moderate progressive. Not that far to the left, you know, a little left of center perhaps, but certainly not socialistic. So what were their goals? What were they trying to accomplish? What were they trying to, you know, get to? Two major goals. And here you can see Touart displayed amongst his knights, progressive knights. These are governors and other figures in the government. To use the government, i.e. the state, to limit the power of the monopoly. So keep in mind, they saw monopoly as the greatest threat to America. It meant the lives of most Americans are in the hands of a very few Americans. And they consider that as undemocratic as absolutism. You know, if 60 people are running the country and the rest of us have to follow, that's not democracy to them. Okay? And then they wanted to improve the general welfare, you might say, and that is the conditions of life in America. They wanted to help make lives better. And guys, I can't lie. You know, students have asked me over the course of my career, when if you could pick a time in history that you would want to live in. I always tell them right now. Right now is the best time to be alive, exception of the pandemic. Obviously, that sucks. But as soon as this thing's over, you know, think about how amazing it is to live in a period where you have unlimited options to music. For $9.99 a month, which is less than a CD used to cost, I can listen to all the music I ever wanted to listen to. I can watch, like you were describing, all the movies you want to see, right? Read all the books you want to read. You guys aren't going to have a problem not having enough comfort in life. You're going to have the problem of having to get through and filter it. You know, you play every video game ever made, you know, so it's an extraordinary period in history. And I give a lot of shout out to these guys. So if you do the right thing, i.e. get a good education, go to college, be smart, do what you're supposed to, then life pays off. I mean, I'm not sitting around moping. I'm like, yeah, I love my life. All right. So that's what these progressives wanted, was to make life good for most people, you know, or as many people as possible. Nothing wrong with that. Now, the thing about progressives, and this is really the first time we've talked about this topic, is it was very, very big at the state level. So in other words, we're not just talking about T.R. Taft and Wilson, who we will talk about, but progressivism was huge in state government. It was an idea whose time had come, meaning a lot of people were progressives. So the most famous progressive was Robert La Follette, who was the governor of Wisconsin. Bob La Follette. They called him Fighting Bob. You know, he was fighting for the people. So you should definitely know Robert La Follette. He was a major figure of the progressive era. And he even ran for president. So if you turn to number 14, this is where this is. Question 14 has Bob La Follette on it. It also mentions Hiram Johnson and Charles Evans Hughes. So there's New York governor and California governor. TR was a governor of New York and a progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive governor of New Jersey. So keep in mind, progressive is not a party. Now, it is capitalized to describe the movement. So a progressive is a type of person. But being progressive is lowercase p, and that was a lot of people. But even beyond the governors who I just mentioned, there were many developments in politics that put more in the hands of the people. So what were some of the developments in the hands of the people? Let's start with the primary. So the primary is very democratic. It allows the people of the state to vote for who the candidate should be. Who the candidate should be to run for the party that they voted for. So if you think about Donald Trump, he won the primary back in 2016 against 13 other candidates. Well, that meant, you know, he was the nominee to run against Hillary Clinton. So the primary is very democratic. It means the people elect the candidate who will run against the other candidate in a two-party system. The increase of the civil service at the state level. The first nationwide, or not nationwide, but states having workman's compensation. It was not nationwide, I emphasize that, sorry. But states, workman's comp, meaning if you were injured on the job as no fault of your own, you would be paid while you're trying to recover from your disability. Okay? We take that for granted today now. Before these laws, You got your arm chopped off in a machine, you were a one-armed machinist. You didn't get any money. You usually got fired, regardless if it was the machine's fault or not. Okay. So then huge change in democratic ideas. We would say that this is when America became more of a democracy, like really more of a democracy. So you have three different things that are very democratic. One is called the initiative. So you're going to get confused between the initiative and the referendum if you're not careful. An initiative means by petition. You guys know what a petition is, right? If 5% of the electorate creates a petition, then the state government has to put that law on the ballot for voting. So that means you can literally bypass the lawmaking body altogether and just the public can create a law. That is called the initiative. We don't use those in Virginia, by the way. In fact, does anybody know which state uses the initiative most frequently? And it's often rated one of the worst run states in the country. It's California. California, they call them propositions out there, blah, 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 right? But their governor doesn't have much authority. It's almost all Democratic. And unfortunately, when you put the hands of people who are self-absorbed and only care about right now, they're going to vote to be stupid a lot of times. Virginia, not usually run that way at all. Not run that way at all. Now, we do have referendum. So a referendum, and we've had referendum here. A referendum is when the lawmakers say, well, we're considering passing this, but we want the public to approve it or not. So if you think about initiative, the voters have to initiate the bill. A referendum is the lawmakers, the legislature allows the voters to vote on it. So that's referring it to them. Let us refer this to the voters. All right. Initiative bypasses the legislature. Referendum, the legislature asks the public vote on it. So, for example, looking out here, I'm looking at the middle school, right? Well, there's 4 beautiful middle schools built by a referendum because Pennsylvania County Board of Supervisors didn't say, let's just build them. They said, let's let the citizens of Pennsylvania County vote on it. And if they vote in favor of it, we'll do it, and we did by 2/3 majority. So that's a referendum. And then you're going to, I think, like if you go online right now, there is a major effort currently to recall the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. You may know that Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California was the governor as a result of a recall of the previous governor. So the recall means you can actually hold an election if you get enough signatures to vote someone out of office early, to kick them out, basically. And so California likes to do these all the time, it seems, more than anybody else. But they tried in Wisconsin a couple of years back to recall their governor. So this is not the same as impeachment. This is actually the people saying, we want you out early. You're fired, kind of thing. Now, at the local level, there was an attempt to get away from the machines, the bosses. And so you start having, like what we have in Danville, particularly, and here in Pennsylvania County, they call him the county administrator, but you had people so you could actually get a degree in city management, urban planning, something like that. And so you get hired to run a city free from vice, free from corruption. So in other words, you're a paid employee and in cities you have, for example, like police commissions. TR was a commissioner of police of New York City. So these are, if you've ever heard like Police Commissioner Gordon, or whatever, these are guys that are hired by the city to run whatever agency and be free from politics. So yeah, it's a really cool job. If you've ever played like The Sims, this is like The Sims in real life, like having to deal with stoplights and, where do you put the road, like all these different things to make sure that the plan works well. It's a really kind of cool gig. All right. Another key group of progressives are women, or were women. So lots of groups that existed, but we want to focus on a few particularly here. Most notably Jane Addams. And I would also mention down here with the Consumers League, Florence Kelley, who was another key product of the excuse me, I have to open this up, of the settlement house movement. So don't forget Florence Kelley, Jane Addams. The settlement houses were where women started trying to help, as you might recall, poor immigrant people. But also they began to realize, hey, there are a lot of problems in the city that are not just simply with children, things like health reform. So it's during this period you have, for the very first time in New York, a public health department run by a guy who actually wanted to make it healthy. So they would wear all white outfits, and they would go through the streets, and they would wash out the refuse, and they would sweep them out clean. And this was the cleanup crew kind of thing. Like, that was their job, was to make sanitation. But this was a major reform movement to improve drinking water, more sanitary, bathroom conditions, just a host of things that we take for granted now. Like, I mean it. Like, if you could go back in history and you saw how different society was, you would really be like grateful now. Like, it would be like, oh yeah, this is awesome. Like, the pandemic has helped a little bit because you've had to wear masks, and we understand how important it is to have hygiene and clean things. But we really do take for granted what these women were able to accomplish. Okay. So Florence Kelley would become a key inspector of public safety and help create here in the U.S. government. I was trying to remember the Consumers League was a private agency, but she became the head. I just read it. Yeah, of the National Consumers League, and then later the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. Okay, so she's going to be one of the key active leaders who will take this to a national level. So one of the things that's beautiful about federalism, I'll remind you about federalism in this moment. Federalism is the idea that we have three levels of government, not just three branches at the top, but we have a national government, we have state governments, and we have local governments, right? So what you see is a whole lot of experimentation at the city and state level. So a whole lot of this stuff at the state level, right? And what happens with these governors and these cities is the ideas become nationally popular. So federalism allows the states to be like incubators of ideas. That's one of the great things about it. It's like, if a good idea works at the state level, then the national level might also work. Try it there. Now, one of the things about women that I want to talk about is the law. So you had a champion of civil rights who will later become a Supreme Court justice. Woodrow Wilson will appoint this man, Louis Brandeis, to become later a Supreme Court justice. He'll be the first Jewish member of the Supreme Court. But he was a lawyer, and he represented women frequently, among other groups that were progressive. And during this period, he is going to represent a group of working women who are defending the right of a state to limit the hours that they work. Now, this is going to sound weird because it doesn't sound very progressive. So the case of Mueller v. Oregon is a tricky one. In this case, Oregon is going to create a law that says women have to have reduced hours because they're the weaker sex. Now, that sounds terrible now, but the principle is the government can create limits to the workday. So that's what Mueller is going to, that's what Brandeis is going to argue, is that is a right or power the state level government should have, is to regulate working hours or conditions. And the case of Mueller upholds that. Now, again, I don't like the idea that women are a weaker physical sex or whatever, but at the time this was progressive because it meant the state government could tell the businesses to limit their work hours or to create better working conditions. Unfortunately, it's ironic. A previous case, the book actually mentions them out of sequence, so I think I do too here. A earlier case had overturned a New York law that had limited bakers' hours, not by gender, but just in general. So they had said that Lochner v. New York, the court ruled that the federal government overreached. It gave, the federal government can't limit a local bakery's baking hours, right? Like, how is that regulating interstate commerce? That's telling a local bakery you can't conduct stuff. So they're going to say that the state can do this, but not the state law limiting, local issues. So it's kind of a tricky one. It's hit and miss. So really, I think Mueller is more of a gender case, and Lochner is more of a state overreach case. Sorry. So yeah, but keep in mind also that during this period, there's a great emphasis by the Bar Association that it's not simply based on oral arguments, but also based on the facts at hand, which is, of course, completely reasonable. But yeah, other key women. So we talked about Florence Kelley, talked about Jane Addams. I must mention Frances Willard, who was both the leader and founder of the WCTU, but she was also a key suffragette and a key reformer. So if you think back to the 1830s, 40s, the reform movement of that period, this is kind of like another wave of reform. Another wave of, now this one is not directly resulting of some great awakening, but it is certainly associated with being a Christian. So when you look at the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Willard and others saw themselves as advocates for the gospel. So keep in mind, social gospel falls in this group. Alcohol fell hardest on working women, or homemakers, excuse me, not working women, but homemakers. Husbands would come home drunk and abuse their families. They would lose money. Husbands would drink and wives would not have enough money to feed the kids. So know the WCTU and know Frances Willard, which I would point out was one of the most powerful groups in America. Helped get the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So key group. All right. So talking about women, other women of the period, and so we've talked about all of these. So I don't think that you have to rewrite each of these ladies' names, although you may want to. But women during the period were almost entirely, shifting out of what had historically been women's work. So think in the past, domestic labor. So in the past, if you're a woman working, you might be a house, servant or a laundress. But now they're entering a lot more of the pink collar, right? Which I mentioned before. That is clerical work. That is working in as a clerk or a typist. So a lot more shift out of traditional domestic work. On the FRQ, you wrote about the lady, the two people who were sharecroppers. Really, it was the husband who was a sharecropper, and the lady was a domestic servant. She had that responsibility to do laundry and things like that. But women were still and are still paid less than men, and obviously they weren't receiving the best jobs. And so that's where you have a variety of reform movements come into place here for women's rights. Margaret Sanger, we've already talked about with birth control. Charlotte Perkins Gilman for the cult of domesticity being a bad idea. And in general, the desire for the right to vote. So in other words, the key movement for suffrage advocates is going to be the right to vote, which we're going to do in another chapter. Although I've already talked to you guys, I think at least once or twice, about Carrie Chapman Catt and NAWSA, N-A-W-S-A, right? So suffrage advocates, temperance advocates, which were really, by this point, prohibitionists, legal reformers, women rights advocates, women in the idea of social reform, social work. And then perhaps I think one of the most notable developments that occurred during this period was the beginning of serious laws to reduce the amount of labor for children. Now, if you think about it today, the thought of a 14-year-old or 11-year-old working a 10-hour workday doesn't sound like progress, right? Like in a factory or in a coal mine here in Dam River Mills. But that was progress. So baby steps, right? Like you have to get to the point where you ban child labor altogether. But before that, you have to reduce child labor. So, that's a key thing, is that this made the factory owners a lot of money. Like having kids getting paid a fourth of an adult male. Most compulsory education laws stopped at 13. So in other words, you had to have at least 2 hours of schooling a day until you were 13, a weekday. So today, you guys are educated you guys really are educated like college students. In fact, you get more education than you will in a college class. In my class, you get 5 hours of direct instruction a week. In many cases, in college, it's 3 hours. So, you guys get a whole lot of opportunity to learn. So that takes you through a lot of the beginning of the chapter. You are certainly welcome and should read back through the first 22 questions. And certainly, one thing I would like to make a mention of, which I didn't, I'll add this to the law or to the reform, is right here. I do want to add. It's going to mess up my numbering. So let me go back here, and don't you worry about if your numbers are off. But I want to add also the Australian ballot is created, and that's crucial. This reform is passed, and that means you can vote in secrecy, right? And so up until this point, people's vote was, when they cast their vote, it was seen publicly. Like the public, as in people watching, could see how you voted, which led to voter intimidation, which led to real problems with these bosses and with employers. And so you're going to see the Australian ballot appear at the national level, and that's a real major reform. A couple other things I would mention. Your first campaign finance laws, they're very, very minimal, and they're only really targeting like the amount of money a person can actually receive. So I'm not going to get into the specific campaign finance laws yet, but there will be an attempt to recognize in the 20th century early that politics is easily influenced by money. Okay. So a lot of the things that we now have as political reforms exist because of this period in history. Okay. So let's go over now to really, again, the thing that makes me like TR the most. It's not really his foreign policy. There are times I agreed with that, but TR was an extraordinarily complicated person who was able to check off so many interesting boxes of who the American people were. This guy was urban in his origin from New York, but he lived in an upstate state. He was from a well-established Dutch Knickerbocker family, one of the kind of ruling families of New York. So he was born a multimillionaire. He had a home on Fifth Avenue, which is where all the rich people live, but he also loved to play in Central Park. He was an elite who hung out with ordinary people, like really ordinary people, ordinary cowboys, ordinary soldiers. And so that made him highly popular. In other words, like, when we see a candidate who is able to sort of reach multiple groups, that's pretty impressive. He was our country's first major conservationist, first major environmental president, who made a note of that. But by far, he was the embodiment of a vibrant country. Until John Kennedy, he was our youngest president. So he was youthful, had a big family. He had a funny voice, but people got over that pretty quick. So he was really fascinating, and he was a very moral guy. I see that's in there. A preacher of morality. For him, life had to be energetic. He was like, one guy called him a steam engine in breeches. Like he was just always going, and he was full tilt. And so he wanted, now keep in mind, he was not elected president initially, but he'll be president for over 7.5 years, almost 8 years presidency. And while McKinley had run on the full dinner pail, remember that, 4 more years, TR certainly was a supporter of that. He didn't want to sort of rock the traditional Republican vote. So what's interesting about TR is he is definitely a Republican Party figure. Like he's very much a part of the Republican Party and agrees with a lot of their policies. Couldn't stand Thomas Jefferson. But what he wants to offer the American people is a square deal. Now, what that means then and now is fair treatment to everyone. Not special treatment for anyone, but fair treatment. Now, he doesn't call it the fair deal. He says in poker or in hand of cards, when you get a square deal, it means nobody cheats. And so for him, they shouldn't be cheating, whoever they are in this case. So everybody should sort of operate on the up and up. Now, later on, Harry Truman is going to create a policy called the fair deal. So, and of course, President Franklin Roosevelt is going to have the New Deal. So after TR, everybody's got to have like a name for their thing, right? Like that's the new tradition. But he is as a domestic leader. Now, keep in mind, most presidents have sort of like 2 major duties: foreign policy, which includes, I would include usually in that matters of national defense. So we've already done sort of like TR's foreign policy. And then they have what they call the domestic policy. So if you were to take this past week in America, President Biden, he ordered a military strike on Syria. So he launched a missile strike. That's foreign policy. He talked on the phone to the president of Mexico, foreign policy, and then he pushed through, and the Senate passed a stimulus bill, domestic policy. So we have domestic policy and foreign policy, right? So TR had at the core of his square deal the 3 C's, and there's an easy way to remember this. 3 C's. So to control the corporations. Now you'll notice it's not cancel the corporation, not do away with corporations, it's control them. One of the things TR really wanted to do was to send a sort of political broadside across the bow of the corporate ship saying, we like American businesses making money, but you guys don't get to operate above the law. Nobody is above the law, okay? And so the corporations are a major target for him. Consumer protection, so that means me and you. And so when you think about clean food, drugs that don't kill you, that's TR. You know, the fact that we are comfortable eating food without wondering, well, gee, is this unhealthy? And then, as I mentioned, he was our first environmentalist president. He was a conservator of resources. And boy, that's a big deal. Okay. So those are the 3 square deal matters. All right. Controlling corporations, consumer protection, and conservationism. So the very first thing he has to deal with at the national level is a strike, okay? It's a strike in what is called the anthracite coal business, all right? So in 1902, coal miners would not talk, coal mine owners, the guys that own the nation's coal mine. Now, I would point out, this is in the winter. And so as soon as the miners went on strike, that meant back then, if you wanted to heat your home, you burned what was called anthracite coal. There's 2 types of coal, bitumen and anthracite. Anthracite is the kind of coal that you would throw in your furnace at your house or in your apartment building. So that's what heated your house. They didn't have gas or electric much back then like we do today. So the miners went on strike because, well, basically life wasn't that good. And the owners refused to what we would call negotiate or collective bargaining. No collective bargaining with the union. So in typical TR fashion, he ordered the head of the union and the heads of the mines to the White House, to Washington. It's the same thing he did with the gentleman's agreement with the San Francisco School Board. And the mine owners, were not going to agree. They assumed that, like Grover Cleveland and like Rutherford Hayes, that the government would back them as opposed to the miners. And TR said, if you don't reopen the mines, negotiate with the miners, I will send in the military. Now keep this, I will send in the military not to break the strike, but to open the mines for the workers. So he is threatening to use force for the miners, is how they interpret it. And the mine owners back down. They don't give the miners everything they wanted, and the miners don't get everything, but that's okay because they get a negotiated settlement. But TR has to flex hard on them. I mean, like, I'll send in the troops. And you can imagine this was a big moment, particularly coming from a Republican, you know, historically are pro-business all the way, right? He also is going to add, at the time, there were one thing. Today, it's 2 different separate, today it's separate cabinet posts. But at the time, it was the Department of Labor and Commerce to help like disputes, to help resolve disputes. So we wouldn't have these violent conflicts between owners and workers to resolve the conflict. And then lastly, and I should probably give you the details here because I don't want to just tell you the Elkins and Hepburn Act. I want to show you what they did. So you may recall that the Interstate Commerce Act had not done anything, right? So the Elkins Act banned rebates, all right? And that meant no more secret kickbacks to businesses if they use your railroad over another. And then you have the Hepburn Act, which also banned, in this case, the free pass. And he also allowed more agents to work for the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce these laws. So the major problem before was that the Interstate Commerce Commission didn't have any power, really. This was like, it existed, but they didn't do anything. Well, now they have enormous power, comparably. And so it looks like for the public, hey, man, this President TR is really coming for helping the public. Now, keep in mind, it was really tilted the other way. Laissez-faire meant the government didn't do anything, or pro-business, right? So now he's trying, I think, and I really do believe this, to balance it. I don't think he's siding purely with labor. He's trying to push the line back to the middle. So if you were a pro-business guy, then this was awful. But, he's saying, and really this is where you get to see it. He's really saying, reminder, no one is above the will of the United States people. He wants a square deal for all people. And so he is going to shock Wall Street, just absolutely blow Wall Street's mind by initiating the very first serious usage, non-targeting union usage, of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And he's going to use it to go after the biggest dog there is. Who's the biggest dog there was? J.P. Morgan. Yes, indeed. Good job. So J.P. Morgan has teamed up with James J. Hill to create a massive monopoly on rail traffic in the northwest of our country. It's called the Northern Securities Company. So imagine J.P. Morgan has teamed up with James J. Hill. And he goes after this, and Morgan is stunned. Morgan will actually say this: let me send my man down to talk to your man. So what Morgan means is, let me send the attorney for my bank to talk to the Attorney General of the United States. And Theodore Roosevelt's like, no way, you're not doing that. You're not negotiating with the Attorney General. And he breaks this company up. But I want to point out this, and it's important. TR, while using this, and the book mentions this, and I'll read it to you. In the great myth of American history, TR becomes the ultimate trust buster, right? Like this great trust buster. And it does point out he goes after the beef trust and a sugar trust as well, a federal, a harvester trust. But if you want to write this down, or at least make note of it, it says here that Roosevelt breaks up 44 corporations in his presidency using the Antitrust Act in the course of his 2 terms, right? 44. His successor, Taft, in 1 term breaks up 90. So TR breaks up 44 trusts, his Justice Department. But he doesn't break up nearly as many as he could. And he's actually going to draw a distinction between what he calls good trusts and bad trusts. All right. And so he's not purely anti-monopoly. He believes that some monopolies don't create a restrained trade. It just, they're organic, we might say. But this is a major decision to actually go after the bad trusts. But it's clearly democratic and political, because not only does he believe this, trusts are bad, the American people believe this. So he considers himself the tribune of the people, like their voice. Now, I will say this: at times, TR circumvents the Constitution. He goes at, the stuff he did with Panama, some of the stuff, it's nothing in the Constitution about the president being able to do what he did at the coal strike, right? Now, I say that saying that I don't know if it's unconstitutional or not. How do we know something's unconstitutional? It goes to the Supreme Court and they tell us. So this case went to the Supreme Court, and not this case, excuse me, this case, the Northern Security case, did go to the Supreme Court, and they upheld the use of the Sherman Act. But there are times when he's going to go further, okay? And I definitely want you to be aware of that. So now, perhaps his greatest tangible legacy at the time, although not long-term, I don't know, maybe one of the long-term legacies. But no, the thing that people are most going to be remembering TR for at the time is going after the unhealthy practices in food and drugs. Okay, and so this is like truth in labeling. You have to have healthy food. And what a great addition to the story of America is being able to have food that you trust. That's like a huge thing, I just ate today a banana, an apple, and some of those mini oranges that are so good, right? And I didn't think for a second, gee, could these harm me? Right? So that's being free to not worry about what food you're eating is harmful or not. So I would know these 5 cases. These 5 examples: coal strike, labor and commerce, Elkins and Hepburn Acts, the Sherman Act with the Northern Securities case. And I think before I don't really want to go into the next section, which is his role in conservation. But I do want to talk about Aristotle for a minute. So Aristotle is one of my favorite philosophers, and I know you're like, what the heck are you talking about Aristotle for? But, you know, Aristotle had an interesting quote about how to live your life. And while it's interesting that TR was not, let's see if I can find it. TR was not what I would consider a calm person. Like, he was just wide open, right? But what he embodied was the goal, and this is why. Oh, sorry, that's huge. He embodies the goal of finding balance. And to me, as I've gotten older in life, balance is one of the great things to kind of use for self-governance. Whoops, as I lock up my computer, unbalanced. So while I'm talking about this, I'm going to stop the recording now, since that's enough for today.